Welcome to the Texas Citizen Journal, an island of reason in the sea of political insanity. And now your host, Reagan Reed.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Texas Citizen Journal show, brought to you by the Texas Citizen Journal and MCPLive.tv. I am your very entertaining and interesting host, Reagan W. Reed. And, we've got a very interesting show for you guys lined up today. So we missed 1 week. It's been a while. I hope you all had a very wonderful Easter. But again, the Texas Citizen Journal, if you're looking for an island of reason in the sea of political insanity, this is the place for you. This is, I like to say, sort of a political homeless shelter. So if you are ideologically too conservative to small government in order to be at home in the Democrat Party, but at the same time, you are too sane and not crazy enough to be fully welcomed in the Republican Party, this is the place for you. And so with that, let's get started. So I've been spending a lot of time the last couple weeks doing probably the thing that I hate the most in life. Hands down, this is by far the worst part of being an adult, and that is doing my taxes. I absolutely hate it. It's awful, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Only people I'd wish it on are the people trying to raise my taxes. But other than that, no, it's awful. So I've been filling out the hated 1099 forms, and gosh, if you don't become just a little bit more libertarian every time tax day it rolls around, I know I certainly do. But the thing I wanted to talk about, and really in my opinion, the worst part about paying taxes, well, there are many worst parts about paying federal income tax, but the thing that really infuriated me is I'm looking at, kind of the self-employment taxes they're taking out and those sorts of things for filling out a 1099, and I'm realizing most of this tax money, this money that I'm paying in taxes, which is a lot, okay, is not, it's going into Social Security. Most of what I'm paying in taxes is towards Social Security. And the most infuriating thing about that is, I know that by the time I turn 65 and by the time I get to retirement age, that money is not going to be there, okay? I am pretty confident Social Security is not going to exist by the time I retire. And probably it will not even exist by the time my parents retire. And so I'm going to spend my whole working life paying into this socialist program, and then I'm still going to be screwed once I retire. And that, to me, that's just infuriating. And the most infuriating part of it is I don't even have a choice. I'm forced by law to spend a huge portion of my income towards this. And because of the boomers and the politicians that the boomers elected, because all the generations before me irresponsibly squandered this, it's not going to be around by the time I'm there. And that's pretty infuriating. I think, and I know that the topic of entitlement reform is not very popular these days, and even in the Republican Party, but the bottom line is, if you look at the federal deficit and you look at the percentages, and we can talk about, there's waste here, or this welfare program here, or this, wasteful program they're putting to study some random thing here that they shouldn't be spending money on, or whatever. At the end of the day, though, all of those, if you put it in perspective, are actually very small parts of the federal budget. The vast majority of our budget and the vast majority of what's driving the debt and these deficits every year is all of these entitlement programs, particularly Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That's the vast majority of it. And so you're not going to get the debt under control unless you do something to reform these programs. And so really what I would like to see, and let me Let me caveat this here before I get all kinds of hate from the boomers. Okay, boomers. I think we should grandfather in the boomers, pun intended. And so if you're above a certain age, and I don't really know what age that would be, but maybe if you're more than halfway through paying into this program, you're getting close to retirement age, we should, or you're currently pulling Social Security, we should grandfather those people in. If you watch this show, if anything, I am an incrementalist, and I believe in making gradual change over time, incrementally. And so grandfather the boomers in. But after that, okay, I think we need to seriously look at privatizing Social Security. And this has been done particularly in Chile. I think the Chilean system is actually quite a good one. And I know Pinochet did a lot of bad things, but he's an interesting figure in my perspective, because as far as I know, he's the only dictator in history that took over in a military coup, and he was a dictator, but then he brought in a bunch of libertarian economists and implemented all these limited government free market reforms. And so it's kind of a weird dictator that takes over and implements libertarian policy. But hey, that's my kind of dictator. But I know Pinochet did do some bad things too. So anyways, what we need to do is create a system to where instead of paying this tax to Social Security, I should have the option at least to put that money towards a private account. And I could have it in that, it'd be secure in that private account. And so then once I get to be retirement age, and by the way, I think we need to raise the retirement age. But once I get to be retirement age, then I can start pulling that money out of that account. And it would have had all this time to accumulate interest. And so I would actually, by that time, have more money in my account. And I would just be a much better system, in my opinion. And like I said, the reason we need to raise the retirement age is because when Social Security was implemented, 65 was around the average life expectancy. And so the idea was about half the people are going to die before they get to be 65 years old. And so you're only really going to be, only about half the population is going to be pulling out of this. And even the ones that are pulling out of it, most of them are only going to be pulling out of this for a couple of years. When Social Security was set up and the retirement age was set at 65, there was really no way, people were not thinking at all that, the majority of the population would reach this age, and that you'd have, most people pulling out of this for, 20 years or more. Nobody expected that at the time. And it's a great thing that life expectancies are what they are. And I expect by the time that I get old, life expectancies will be even longer. My goal is to live to be even more than 100. And I think that's very plausible that will happen by that point. But because of advances in medical technology. But as the life expectancy gets older, it's only natural we need to start pushing the retirement age further and further and further back. And again, I'd say grandfather in the people that are in it now, but especially moving forward, we need to push that age back because the way that the program is now, it is totally unsustainable. But the bottom line, and here is probably the biggest reason why these programs are unsustainable, is that not only is the life expectancy different than it was then, but the birth rates have changed dramatically. Birth rates have gone way, way down since the mid-1900s. And so really, in order for a program like Social Security to work, you have to have way more workers currently active in the economy than you do retirees that are dependent upon it. And so the more retirees you get, and the bigger part of a ratio they become to workers, the harder it is for these programs to become sustainable. And so at some point, you may even, people have less and less kids. You may even get to the point where, you have almost as many retirees dependent upon the system as you do workers providing. And so providing the tax revenue. And so that is just simply not sustainable. And it's a huge problem just to see, what we have to look forward to. Actually, our birth rate in the U.S. is one of the better ones in the developed world. If you look at countries like China or Japan, they are really really bad shape. And in the long term, China's going to be in real trouble. And so I think that's why if they make a move on Taiwan, they're going to have to do it fairly soon, because they're going to be in real trouble with those low birth rates due to their one-child policy. And we have good birth rates, and actually one of the saving graces for our demographics has been immigration, because we've not only is our birth rate a little bit higher than most developed countries, but we're also welcoming in lots of new immigrants, and they contribute to the economy. And so the U.S. right now is in better shape, but still, we don't have nearly the birth rate or the demographics to support Social Security as it was originally envisioned. And so that's why I say we need to reform this system. We need to privatize Social Security. And, instead of you paying the taxes every year into this fund or whatever, no, you have your own private bank account, your own private account for this, and you pay into it, and you can get interest, let that accumulate interest over time. And then by the time you reach retirement age, which should be well older than 65, then you start pulling out of it. And the system like this would put you in control, not some politicians up in DC. And it would be much better, but I get it. Nobody wants to touch it because nobody wants to do the right thing or institute the reforms that are needed. People just want to dole out the bread and the circuses. So speaking of tough reforms, another area where, it's obvious what we need to do to fix the problem, but the politicians are probably not going to want to do it because it would cause pain in the short term, is the issue of inflation. And, of course, inflation is a very, very complicated issue, and people are quick to blame Biden and blame the current administration. And he does deserve some blame when it comes to this topic, but ultimately the issue is much more complex. A lot of the spending that is making the inflation problem worse was actually done under the Trump administration, and people don't want to talk about that, but there were all of these trillions of dollars spent during the Trump years too, and he was just as bad when it came to deficits as Obama or Biden for that matter. And so really this spending is in a lot of ways a bipartisan problem, but I'm not arguing. Biden has made this worse in a lot of ways. He came into office with COVID, making the economy as it is. And so bottom line, what is inflation? Inflation basically, in the simplest sense, is where you have too much money chasing too few goods. And so with all of our supply chains down during COVID and disrupted, you don't have as much production going on. And it's taken a while to get these supply lines up and running and to get production back up to where it needs to be. But at the same time, you've infused, again, both under the Trump and the Biden administrations, you've infused all this extra cash into the economy. And on top of that, you have gas prices going up. And of course, that's a huge driver of inflation, because not only does the rise in gas prices affect you when you go to the pump, but also pretty much everything you buy is transported on some sort of vehicle that uses gas. And so, it really drives up the cost of pretty much everything. And so, again, this was kind of an existing problem, but the Biden administration has made it worse by their war on domestic energy production. And the Biden administration is trying to pin this all on Putin and Russia right now. And they have a point in one sense, in that inflation is going to be much worse, and these problems are all going to be exacerbated. But Putin didn't cause the supply chain issues. He didn't cause the spike in gas prices. We've already been seeing these things over the last couple of years. And so, Putin's going to make them worse. And in the situation in Ukraine is going to make everything worse. And we're not even seeing the half of it yet. Just wait until the wheat supply is going to be disrupted here this summer. That's going to be really bad for large parts of the world. But anyways, how do we fix this problem? Because I think that a big part of the Republican messaging, the Republican campaign, to the extent that they have any coherent message, which is debatable, is campaigning against inflation. And I think that just the topic of inflation alone, not alone the rising crime and other issues that we have in this country, I think inflation is going to be a big factor why Republicans will take the House in November. But the bottom line, what are Republicans going to do about inflation? And I'm not entirely sure that they're going to do much of anything. I think the only thing that Republicans will do to stem inflation is I think they will put a hold on some of the spending. And so you can say goodbye to any chance of Build Back Better or anything like that being passed. But beyond that, I'm not sure anyone in Washington has what it takes to make inflation better. And so you ask, well, why is that? Well, I think we need to talk about what needs to be done in order to make inflation better. And so there are a couple of steps. And so here's what I think we need to do. First and foremost, I think we need to raise interest rates. And that's going to definitely hurt in the short term, and it may actually trigger a small recession. But at the end of the day, you can't get this runaway inflation under control, and you can't stop the economy from overheating like it is until you raise interest rates. If you look back to history, if you look back to the 1970s and the runaway inflation we had then, it was not until they raised interest rates under the Reagan administration that you started to get that problem under control. And so people may not like it. It may not be a popular thing to do, and it may hurt in the short term, but you got to raise interest rates. It's got to happen. And you're not going to get inflation under control unless it does. And yes, it's going to be painful in the short term, but if you don't do it and you just let inflation spiral out of control, it will be a lot more painful in the long term. The other thing, there's too much money going around. And so the Fed needs to stop printing so much money. We need to tighten the money supply, and money printer doesn't need to be going burr so much anymore. Slow down printing. And then kind of on that related note, you need to slow down spending. This is not the time to be passing these massive welfare schemes or, progressive fever dreams of all these added government programs and trillions of dollars in spending. I mean, it's just insane right now. The government needs to tighten their belts just like everyone else is tightening our belt. And I mean, as a conservative, I would say there's really never a good time for a lot of these big government programs, but especially in our current economic situation, the absolute last thing that we need to be doing is pumping more money into the economy, okay? Draw the connection, folks. More money in the economy, the money's becoming worth less. There's a correlation here. That is one of the factors that's leading to more inflation. And then finally, if inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, not only do we need to have less money flooding the economy, but we need to ramp up the production of goods. And so this includes making the ports more efficient. We need to repeal the Jones Act. And I don't have time to get into explaining the Jones Act, but basically, it's this thing that passed that gives the unions a lock on our ports, and it drastically decreases the efficiency of American ports. We have some of the worst ports in the entire world in this country, and the Jones Act is part of this. We need to get rid of that. We need to get rid of all tariffs that are not directly related to national security. So, I mean, I support tariffs on like China and Russia for national security reasons. I think we need to be disentangling our economy from China as much as possible. But in terms of like the tariffs that the Trump administration put on, for example, Canadian lumber, and that the Biden administration kept in place, that's why lumber is going up so much, is because they put tariffs. And so we can't import cheaper Canadian lumber because of these stupid tariffs. Okay, tariffs, if people know anything about economics, they are a tax, they hurt the consumer. So when you place a tariff on something, you are hurting the American consumer. And so we need to repeal all tariffs and have as much of a free market as possible. And again, unless the tariff is directly related to some sort of national security. But I don't think that there's a national security threat to that comes from importing like Canadian lumber. Come on, people, that's stupid. And then finally, we're talking about ramping up production. We need to open the floodgates of American oil. So all these permits that have been held up by the Biden administration on drilling, we need to let those go, and let people drill as much as possible. Really aggressive domestic energy production, and we need more pipelines like the Keystone Pipeline. Let that come down and really ramp up as much domestic production as possible and be exporting as much oil as possible to Europe in order to strengthen our hand over there and help wean their horrible dependence and addiction to Russian oil and natural gas. And so if we ramp up production, we can decrease the global cost of oil, and again, bringing oil prices down will ultimately help bring down the prices of pretty much every good. And so those are the steps I think we need to do to get inflation under control. Raise interest rates, stop printing so much money, stop spending so much money, and ramp up production and fix the supply chain issues. And you do those things, and you start to get inflation into a more manageable situation and just have a healthier economy in general. But the Biden administration's not doing those things. In a lot of areas, they can't. And I'm not so sure that Republicans have what it takes to do those things either, because a lot of those things require short-term pain and may be unpopular when you do them. But at the end of the day, those are the policies that work. That's what worked in the 80s. That's what would work now, and it's got to be done, folks. So with that, enough economics. We're going to go to a very quick commercial break, and we will be back shortly, and we're going to go into more of the punditry and election analysis side of things. And so if you want to hear about punditry on some of the hottest primaries going on right now, stay tuned. We'll be right back with you in a moment.
Hello, and welcome to MCPLive.tv. I'm Bill Brenza, and along with Billy Graff, we own and operate MCPLive.tv. Now, we do this as a service to the people of Montgomery County, but like everybody else, we need funding to be able to produce better shows and more shows for you, our viewers. The way we have done that is we have set up an account with Patreon. Patreon is spelled Patreon, so it's www.patreon.com/MCPLiveTV. If you go on there, you can make a donation to us on a monthly basis. These continuing donations will allow us to improve the content and the number of shows that we're providing to you. You can become a subscriber for as little as $3 per month. So please go ahead and log on to patreon.com and become a subscriber of MCPLive.tv.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you stuck around through the economics lesson we had here. And so we're going to get more into the political side of things now. We hear a lot of talk about the midterms, and I do think the Republicans are going to take back both the House and the Senate, for that matter, although the Senate's a little bit more more iffy. But before we can get there, and really before I could even predict whether Republicans are going to take the House or the Senate, we have to get through the primaries. And so in many respects, the primaries are going to be determinative of what kind of Republican Party we're going to have and indeed what the future of the party is going to look like. And specifically, the specific way, I think, is how much influence is Donald Trump going to have on the party moving forward? And so there's a lot of people saying, well, his influence looks like it may be waning. And, a lot of people say, well, he's still the favorite to be the nominee in 2024. But I think that we're going to have the clearest indicator on that once we're done with a lot of these primaries. Because, and this is a very interesting political move and pretty much unprecedented by an ex-president, but Donald Trump has been making endorsements in a lot of these Republican primaries. And he's made endorsements in a lot of primaries that are going to have an obvious winner. And so he'll endorse an incumbent. And that is going to help him with his win rate. And he's endorsing people that are not contested. And obviously they normally win. But he's waded into some pretty controversial primaries. And he's made some pretty controversial endorsements. And so whether those people win, whether or not his endorsement is able to get them over the finish line, is going to be, I think, a very interesting indicator of how much influence he has over the party, in particular, how much influence he has over the average Republican voter. And so I wanted to walk through a couple of these primaries that you need to have on your radar and that are really going to be bellwethers. So first of all, would be the Georgia gubernatorial primary. And now that is going to be between the incumbent Brian Kemp, who Trump hates for some reason. But Kemp, if you look at his actual voting record, he has probably one of the most conservative voting records in the entire country. Probably second only to Ron DeSantis. I'd say he's the second most conservative governor in the country. He signed a heartbeat bill into law long before Texas did. He passed one of the strongest voter security bills. And people don't remember, but just a few short years ago when he was the Secretary of State, Stacey Abrams and the Democrats were, absolutely just going after this guy, saying that he was suppressing the vote and he was the champion of voter suppression because he was so zealous in making sure that the voter rolls were accurate and up to date. And so stellar conservative voting record. My understanding is most of the conservative activists and in the business community too is really sticking behind Kemp. But because Kemp would not break Georgia law in order to hand the state over to Trump, Trump hates him and carries on a grudge forever. And so Trump has recruited former Georgia Senator David Perdue, who actually lost in a runoff last year, to challenge Kemp in the Republican primary. And, again, it's not really a campaign of issues. Really, Perdue's only advantage is that he has the Trump endorsement, and that's heavily what he's campaigning on. And so probably more than any race in the country, this Perdue versus Kemp contest is going to be the biggest bellwether of Trump's influence on the party. And if Kemp wins, it's going to show that Trump's influence is definitely waning. And if Perdue is able to knock off the incumbent Kemp, it's going to show you really need to have Trump's endorsement to win. So far, though, I don't think it's looking good for Trump because all of the polling and fundraising numbers generally indicate Kemp is pretty far ahead. Looks like he has a pretty solid lead. And so if I was to call it now, I think that he's going to win. The other race to watch there is the Senate race, and that primary doesn't look like it's going to be very contested. I think that the former football player, Herschel Walker, is pretty much a lock to win that primary. And it's a really interesting situation where both Trump and Mitch McConnell have both coalesced behind Herschel Walker. So the party seems to be pretty united behind him. He really needs to brush up on some of his policy, but the race between Herschel Walker and the Democrat senator there in Georgia, Raphael Warnock, is going to be one of the key Senate battles you need to watch in determining which party is going to maintain control over the upper chamber. Probably the most controversial endorsement that Trump has made is in the Pennsylvania Senate race, where he recently released a statement endorsing Dr. Mehmet Oz. That's right, the famous television personality, Dr. Oz. He is running for Senate in Pennsylvania as Republican. And there's a couple of candidates in that race, but the main opponent is actually former hedge fund manager David McCormick, who is pretty much an establishment guy. But in preparation for his Senate run, he started to become very Trumpy, and he actually hired Hope Hicks and Stephen Miller and a number of other people in MAGA world to help him. But that was not enough to get Trump's endorsement. That went to Dr. Oz. And a lot of people, even in Trump world, have been criticizing the former president over this endorsement. Oz has a very mixed record. He's been in support of abortion and gun control in the past, and has kind of some progressive views. And so a lot of people question how sincere his recent conversion to conservatism is. And a lot of people wonder, well, why would Trump endorse him? And I think a big part of that is that Trump is really not ideological. He's not an ideologue in that sense. He's a populist, and I don't think he's not a conservative. He's a populist, and there's a difference. And so I think Trump's the kind of guy who kind of goes with his gut, and I think he kind of likes fellow celebrities too. And so in Oz, he sees kind of a kindred spirit. And Oz, again, just like Trump, is an outsider. And so I think that they have that similarity as well. But it's very interesting, and it'll be very interesting to see how that race plays out. So far, McCormick has had not a landslide lead, but a pretty steady lead over Oz in most of the polling. And I haven't really seen polling that's been entirely after Trump endorsed Oz. And so really that's going to be an interesting test. If Trump can bring Oz from polling lower and get a primary win for him, I think that would really speak to his influence. And again, this is going to be another bellwether race in November, because the Democrats need to win this seat to keep control of the Senate. And they're going to have a very contested primary too, between Congressman Connor Lamb, who's more of like an establishment Democrat. He's the safer choice. And then their lieutenant governor, who is kind of, let's just say, if Bernie Sanders was a biker, if Bernie Sanders was in a biker gang, that is Fetterman, who is the other Democrat candidate, and it looks like he's going to be the nominee. He's their lieutenant governor. Very, very interesting figure, but very, very far left. The most recent Trump endorsement, as of the release of this show, is in the Ohio primary, which has been a very contested race. Rob Portman, the senator there, is retiring. And so it's really a free-for-all to replace him. And there's about at least 4 or 5 candidates that are neck and neck that have the potential to win this. And probably the 2 most well-known would be the Ohio State Treasurer, Josh Mandel, who's kind of just an average run-of-the-mill Republican, but has said some very, very crazy things lately. And the other, probably the most well-known candidate, is J.D. Vance. And you may know him as the author of the book Hillbilly Elegy, which is a pretty good book, actually. I have it. And then Ronnie Howard actually made a movie about J.D. Vance's life. And so for the past few months, Vance and Mandel have been in a contest to basically be who can say the most crazy things. And they've said one outrageous thing after another, and which is making me concerned about, well, if they go this crazy in the primary, what does that bode for them in the general election? And they've both been vying pretty heavily for the former president's endorsement, but who did it go to? Well, the coveted Trump endorsement went to J.D. Vance in the Ohio primary, which again is a little bit odd because J.D. Vance in 2016 was actually a never Trumper. And he made some very, very unflattering statements about Trump back in 2016. And he even made one statement said he wondered whether Trump may be the American version of Hitler. And so he was not a fan of Trump. And I like the 2016 J.D. Vance. But in gearing up for running for the Senate, he's become extremely Trumpy and very much of a Trump sycophant and acolyte. And J.D. Vance is probably, I'd say, one of the most interesting figures in American politics right now, and it's for this reason, that J.D. Vance on the issues is not a traditional, conventional conservative. Okay, he is part of what's called the National Conservative Movement, and basically what the NatCons, for short, believe is they're very conservative on the social issues, and particularly immigration. But on the fiscal issues, the National Conservatives are really, I mean, they're almost socialists. To say they're almost socialists on fiscal issues is not an exaggeration. They want a big government. They just want to be the ones in charge of the big government. And this is ultimately the end of populism. Populism is all about the common people taking control of the government and wielding it against the elites or whatever people they don't like. And J.D. Vance has really been a big proponent of this populism. And unlike a lot of these populist types, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I don't think is intellectually coherent enough to define populism, J.D. Vance is actually an extremely intelligent man. And he's very articulate, and he is an ideologue. So I think if he got in the Senate, he would actually be able to make pretty intellectually coherent arguments for his populist, national conservative vision for the Republican Party. And so it's very interesting that Trump endorsed him. And that's a race where Trump's endorsement, I think, could make a real difference, especially because all these candidates seem to be neck and neck, and they're all trying to out-Trump one another. And now that Trump has given his seal of approval to J.D. Vance, in Ohio, you actually don't have runoffs. So you just need to get the bare majority. And so even if the Trump endorsement bumps J.D. Vance up another 5 or 10 percentage points, which it very well may do, that'll be enough. When the polling's tied right now, that could be enough to put him over the edge. So one race where Trump's endorsement may not have been that powerful was in Alabama. And Trump's kind of had a mixed record in Alabama in the past. But as we talked about on the show before, Mo Brooks, the congressman from northern Alabama, running for Senate, really was a Tea Party guy and then was very, very Trumpy. And Trump had endorsed him. But he's a bad campaigner, and so he's just been going down, down, down in the polls. And Trump, rather than take a loss in Alabama, he thought Mo Brooks was going to win, and so he pulled his endorsement. And so this could be an early indicator that, maybe in certain circumstances, the Trump endorsement is not enough to keep you up in the polls. The final primary I want to deal with is that in Alaska. And you have, Alaska is such a weird state politically, but there's Senator Lisa Murkowski, probably the most to the left Republican in the Senate. And I have very mixed feelings about Murkowski because, again, Alaska is a red state. And so, like Susan Collins, I am okay with giving Susan Collins some leeway because she has to run in Maine. Okay, and I understand she sometimes has to take votes that will appeal to, Maine, which is actually a pretty blue state. But Alaska is a red state, so there's no reason why Murkowski shouldn't be conservative. And unlike Susan Collins, on the really important issues when the Republicans really need all the votes they can get, Susan Collins does tend to fall in line. Murkowski's not dependable, okay? But at the same time, Murkowski did vote for the Trump impeachment, and she has shown independence against Trump, and so I appreciate her stand in that regard. And that's gotten her a primary challenger. I think it's one of the state officials, maybe the state treasurer, Kelly Tshibaka, who's running with Trump's endorsement. And so it's going to be a very interesting race. But Alaska, here's the catch in Alaska. They have what's called ranked choice voting. And so basically, it's a very complex system, but the long and the short of it is that instead of just voting for one person, you vote for 4 people and you rank them in order of how you prefer them. And so, you'll rank your first choice and then your second choice and third and fourth. And so then all the votes are tabulated, and the person who got the least amount of first choice votes, they get eliminated, and their votes, like their second place votes, get allocated to the other 3 remaining, and then you eliminate the third, then you only have 2 left, and you combine the second place preference votes of the people who voted for the ones that were eliminated, and it's kind of like a runoff, only it happens instantly. And so this could allow Murkowski to stay in, because you could have like Democrats voting for Murkowski as their second choice, and ranked choice voting tends to benefit people who are able to form broader coalitions, so the people who appeal more to the middle, as opposed to the extremes. It's kind of like vanilla ice cream. Why is vanilla ice cream so ubiquitous? Well, it's not really most people's favorite, but it's not really that objectionable to most people either, and so therefore it's common. And so with ranked choice voting, you kind of get a similar deal. You don't necessarily get the candidate with the most devoted following if it's small, but you get the candidate who's the least objectionable to the most amount of people. And that may be Murkowski's saving grace. And it may be a weak spot for another candidate running in Alaska, and that is none other than Sarah Palin, of all people, who has made a re-entry into the electoral scene. The longtime congressman from Alaska, Don Young, who's been there since the late Pleistocene, I believe, passed away recently. And so there'll be a special election to fill his seat. And Sarah Palin and like 50 other candidates have filed to run for that. And so Palin got the Trump endorsement and is probably the front runner. But the problem for Palin is, again, it's ranked choice voting. She definitely, I would say, has the most passionate following, but does she have the broadest appeal? And so when all the choices in the second favorite votes are tabulated out, are the votes from all these other candidates all going to go to Palin, or will they go to somebody else? Because she's a very polarizing figure. You love her or hate her, she is polarizing, and most people have an opinion of her. And so that's going to be a very interesting race to watch. And so I wanted to throw these out here. Those are the races that you should be watching nationally as the primaries gear up. And I think the primaries are not only going to be important in determining what kind of Republican Party we're going to have, but they'll be determining, who's the strongest person to be our nominee. And if we get a weak nominee, we may lose some of these Senate races and not be able to take the Senate. And if we get all strong nominees, we may get a pretty sizable majority in the Senate. So a lot comes down to these primaries. Pay attention to these primaries. Know these candidates. And if you have friends living in any of these states that we talked about, you need to contact them and make sure they know to go vote in their primary and when that is coming up. And so with that, of course, we will have coverage for you when we know the results of these different elections. But with that, we are going to wrap up the show. Hope you enjoyed watching it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you're not already subscribed to mcplive.tv, you definitely should be. So please go ahead and subscribe. Help them out. They're doing some great work, producing some great content. And be sure to like and share this, and let your friends know about the Texas Citizen Journal. Again, let me know what you think. I do want to hear from you, and I do read all those comments. And so with that, have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the position of the management and ownership of MCP.TV.